Hi everyone, in this small tutorial I will show you how to make a drivable train car in CryEngine using the CryPhysics. I'm not using any kind of animation here, and also I'm not using the track view sequences, so this object, this train car, will be moving on a spline, and its movement will rely purely on the physics engine. And I'm using the default CryPhysics. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, what you need to do to make a drivable train car, you need a track that this car will be moving. So you need a path, or in this case, this will be a simple shape spline. And you can create one using the area shape tool. So you just drag and drop it and place your points. And after you've done creating your shape, you can choose whether it will be the closed or open one. I choose the open version. So here is my shape. And the more points you have, the smoother the final spline will be. So you have created your path, and now all you need to do is to assign a physics component to this shape. And this is a physics area component. So you just press the button add components and physics area. Okay, so here all we have to do is to choose a type. So I choose spline, and it says the tooltip from area shape. And that's what we need to do for this path. That's pretty much it. You have a path, you have a physics area that created the actual spline for our train car, and you can visualize it if you go to wireframe view, and also if you show the physics proxy. So as you can see, this is the tunnel that's representing this path. And also, if we look closely, we can see this. Actually, let me hide this one. We would see the representation of the spline itself. So this thin red line, I'm not sure if this is visible on this video, but this is very thin, the red line. This is the actual spline that is created from the shape points. So the object will be moving on this spline, not on these points. And if you want your train car to move by buoyancy, like air or water or custom gravity, you can definitely use it, and you just need to make sure that your shape radius is big enough to encompass your train car object. So we have a path. Now we need to make our train car moving using this created track. And it's actually pretty simple. So all you have to do, by the way, I'm using the standard static mesh entity, and you want to make sure that your train car is looking in the Y axis, plus Y. And what you need to do is to add component, and this will be a line constraint. So you just press the add component button and physics constraint, line constraint. So I've created one, and this line constraint needs to have the proper axis. So in this case, the y-axis is our front, and we need to make sure that the axis is 1 on y. And you can see this line constraint in this thick line in the wireframe view. And then you have to do a tricky part. You have to link this static mesh entity to this path using the link tool. So you just press pick your path, then don't forget to exit this tool, and you have to copy the name of your path. And I named this path before I link this entity, and you have to copy this name to helper link name, like that. And that's it. Your train car is now sitting on this path, and you can move it freely if you just try to enable physics, and for example with the pull physics tool you can just move it freely, and this object will follow your path from start to end. Okay, so how to make this object drivable so we can control its movement? For example, we can accelerate this train car, and we can use brakes and stop it. So what I've done is a small flow graph like this. By the way, I'm using the entity components nodes. So if you don't see flow graph nodes entity components, you have to enable them. And the CVAR for this is ES_enable flow graph components. So here's a pretty simple setup. I'm using a thruster components to accelerate and decelerate, or actually to stop the train car, and I'm going to show you these thrusters. So I made one thruster at the end of my car, and again, this is just a component, physics thruster. So what it's basically doing is just adding a constant acceleration, and I have two components, two thrusters. One is actually pushing our car forward, and the other one is pushing our car backward. So it's basically, this is the brake and this is the accelerator. And these thrusters have a constant thrust, and it's pretty big value here, and I will explain it why it's so big later. So here in the flow graph, I'm using just debug keys. For example, I have the E key for acceleration and Q key for brake. And I'm just using the node called entity components thruster functions enable constant thrust. So you have entity components, thruster, and functions. You have three functions here, but I'm using the enable constant thrust. And I'm just make sure that I have the one node that let me just enable this thruster, and the other one is just a disabled version. And I'm using just a simple logic to switch between them. Also, if you have multiple identical components, so for example, here I have two thruster components, they have a different component type index, so I need to make sure that, for example, this is the brake, and the brake component is the one that has the index of 1, and the accelerator have the index of 0. Then I just making a simple metrics. So I'm just using the entity velocity and just displaying the debug message of how much speed I currently this car have. Also, I'm checking the speed value, and I want to make sure that if the current velocity is less than the pretty small value of 2, I want to make sure that I disable all of these components, and especially the brake thruster, because I don't want to car continue to move in backward directions, and this will happen if you don't disable this component. And the last thing that I want to point out is that you need to actually play with the mass values and with the damping, with the simulation parameters. So you have to test the simulation parameters, and you have to play with the mass. And I found out that for this particular example, I have a mass of 3,000 kilograms, and I have a damping of 0.3. Why I'm using the damping? Because, well, let me show you. Just if I disable damping and I try to simulate this car, so I'm pressing the E key and it's accelerating, and now I want to brake. I press the brake key. Okay, it's stopping, but as you can see, it's this car continued to move with a pretty low velocity, but it's inertia continue, and I need to stop this car completely, but I can't. So I'm just using damping with this pretty small value, and for this to actually work properly, I need to increase the constant thrust on the thrusters, because damping is actually constantly slowing down our rigid body, and we need to compensate this. So if I want to maintain the speed that I had before, I have to increase the thruster, constant thrust amount. And now, if I try to run it, okay, let's accelerate, and let's try to brake. Okay, it's actually stopped. So now it's completely stopped. It's not moving, and that's what I need. And again, all I need to continue the movement, I need to just accelerate. And again, I'm using brakes, and it's working. Great. So this is the pretty simple setup of how to make a drivable train car that is using the CryPhysics, and this object is moving using the constraint system, and it has pretty simple flow graph logic. So I hope with the release of 5.7 we'll have a new visual scripting system, and we can recreate this train car with the visual system. Okay, so that's it for the video.